Linux Mint has consistently given us really good updates, a really good listening to the community, and just some really overall good contributions to the Linux community as a whole, not just for its own little center of the universe. And today we're going to look at how this continues to be a trend as we look at this month's newsletter, which I got to say is it was fascinating to read. So definitely have a look at it. The newsletter will be linked below, but we're going to go through it in this video if you haven't had a chance to read it, or do you just want to see some thoughts and reactions to it. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming on back to another Switched to Linux video. If you've not already subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do that. And of course, Linux Mint is certainly my favorite Linux distribution. And whether we're using the Ubuntu version or we are using the LMDE version, they're both really good. Of course, I prefer the Cinnamon desktop so much. On my brand new Raspberry Pi 5, I have Cinnamon running on that through Armbian. You can have a look at that video. Will be linked down there in the YouTube here. I'll put it on the cards and maybe down below. But Cinnamon is my favorite desktop environment overall. It just stays out of your way. It's modern but functional, and it just has that workflow that I like the best. It's not like it's superior for all people, for all things. Everyone has their own different preferences, and just for me, and I've tested all the different desktop environments, I'm familiar with all of them, but I always just go back to Cinnamon as the best, the cleanest, and the most modern look for me. But let's go ahead and dive on into the newsletter and see what is going on, because this, I gotta say, is one of the best newsletters from Linux Mint that I've read, because there's just so much going on as we move into the next version of Linux Mint. So the first thing that they are doing is they are testing a new repository powered by the Fastly Content Delivery Network. So this will enable us to have basically one setup inside of your repository, and then that same setup can be used anywhere around the world through a CDN. Of course, you can always still go online and grab the repositories at some other custom location, and we'll talk down the road here in a next section here about why one might want to do that, possibly, but I have to speculate on a couple of things here coming up. Now, I went ahead and changed one of my computers over to this beta test. It was super easy, super fast to do. And if we just went ahead over to this GitHub page, it will give you all of the information that you need to do that. And so in order to pull off this change, what you're going to need to do is launch your software sources tool, restore the default settings, and then you're going to edit the repository list. This is going to be done most likely in the terminal. It's possible to do it in the GUI, but do it in the terminal. I used Nano in mine, but just use whatever terminal-based editor you prefer, and just change your first line of your file. There should be your Linux Mint packages, which should be packages.linuxmint.com. And you're going to replace this with fastly.linuxmint.io. Make sure you do that .io, not .com. This does also support HTTP or HTTPS, so you can do both, whichever one you would prefer. And by utilizing this, you can have really good, really fast updates to your system. Now, remember, Linux Mint does updates through Ubuntu and Linux Mint, or through Debian and then Linux Mint. So this just impacts the Linux Mint repositories, and presumably, I didn't notice there in the notes, but presumably this works on LMDE just as well as it works on Linux Mint, I think. Let's double check that before I get into it. Maybe we'll get something down there in the comments. I don't want to be STL's fake news again here, guys. So, but overall, this will allow it to work really fast. I did my first update, and I've never seen the Chromium web browser download so quickly. Of course, that is now in the Linux Mint repository on the Ubuntu version, since Ubuntu is forcing you to use the snap for that now. So they have that in their repository now. The other thing I want to look at is the Datadog is a data collection thing. Now, this one here is a little bit hairy because Obviously, I'm not a huge fan of data collection, and Linux Mint doesn't do a lot of data collection. There is no telemetry inside of the operating system, and there never will be telemetry inside of the operating system. Where they do their statistics is when you first load up your web page on the default Firefox, it'll take you to the Linux Mint page. That will collect some information. And the way I'm reading this, it sounds like this might be tied to their website repository, which means the new cloud-based repository. Most people might use that now since it works really well. That can be tied in. Now, it is possible, if my theory is correct, if you don't want to be part of this, you can change this to another repository for the Linux settings that's not Linux Mint. And presumably, if you're downloading your Linux Mint updates from the nearest university, for example, you wouldn't be included, but I just don't know. This is a big unknown for me. But what they're doing with Datadog allows you to do customized data analytics. It would be really nice to see a little bit of transparency, and they might have it somewhere on separate posts, but it'd be nice to see their transparency. How exactly are they configuring their system? Because if you go over to Datadog's site, they are a cloud monitoring system, but they do say they focus on transparency, privacy as a feature, and global compliance. Part of this is that they can choose the endpoint. In this case, Linux Mint can choose which country they're storing their data in. Are they storing it in the United States? Are they storing it in China, in Russia? Or are they going somewhere that's a lot more data privacy, like Netherlands? I believe that's where Startpage is, which has very stringent laws. Switzerland, very stringent laws about who can access that. That's why Proton is there. You know, they will not respond to anything other than a local police, a warrant, and the local police need a lot of stuff for a warrant. All right, so it'd be interesting to see where they're choosing to host their data, what data they are collecting, what data they are excluding, and they do have information about what data that the system can keep and just drop right away. So it'd be nice to see their setup. Again, this information might be somewhere, just not in the newsletter. But overall, having a long track record of Linux Mint, I do trust them with this, and so I'm not completely opposed to this. But of course, analytics gets to a hairy thing, and as long as it's not in my operating system itself, then there are ways to circumvent it. And so it'd be interesting to look down the road to see what ways we have to do that, or do we know we want to be part of their data collection to help them with the data they need? And those are good questions to ask. The next one, Matrix. Obviously, Hex Chat has died out. They've created the Juggernaut app, which they said they are going to keep as IRC, but since, they got a lot of feedback on that saying, hey, why don't you look at doing Matrix instead, especially since they do a lot of Flatpak stuff, and Flatpak has the Element Matrix client, which is the one that I use. And they're like, we looked into it, and yeah, we're on Matrix too. So you can go over to Matrix and get some support from them, and their Matrix link is right down here in the notes. These show notes, this blog post will be in the notes. So if you are on Matrix, you can go ahead and check that out. Also, of course, we are on Matrix on Switch to Linux. And I believe, thanks to Salbu, I believe we are now available in the public directory. I just didn't have the time to figure that out. He was able to figure that out. I think we're in the public directory. If we are not, tlm.li/matrix. That will find you our Linux Mint room, and then you can choose which room you want to join on the server itself. But definitely go on over. They are a very kind and very friendly group over there, and what they're doing here is they're not installing the Flatpak. There was some discussion on the Matrix server in the last 24 hours about should we just install the Flatpak or packaged Element client. And they're like, we don't want to do that. And there's some very good reasons for it with how things move and packaging and things like that. So what they opted for is, since Linux Mint already has the really excellent web app application, and since Element also works as a web application through any web browser, what they have done is they have set up a web app, so it is in the menu. You can access Matrix via the Element web app. And then, of course, you can customize that through the web app's navigation panel, which is inside of Linux Mint as well. You have a look over here. hit your connect to matrix, and this is going to give you your web application, presumably through Firefox, which I think is going to be their default web browser. So this is a web app. Of course, you can manage that and modify it, or you can delete it if that's not useful for you. But it's just another way of them having ways to reach out to them for support or for help. This is a great new service. So I am over there in the matrix room as well. So you might find me over there. Next one, this one is bigger than we think, because there's a discussion about, in Linux, should all of your applications look the same? Some people feel strongly about it, some people don't. I generally don't care as much if every single application I have looks exactly like every other application. I like it a little bit, but I'm not completely married. I refuse to use said app because it does not look like every other app. I'm not that dogmatic. I would kind of prefer everything looks the same. Now, Linux Mint really focuses on making sure everything looks the same, and this has raised a question about other desktops such as Gnome, which specifically is going in a way to make all of these Gnome apps, which explicitly do not work well with every other desktop environment. They won't respond to the themes, they don't have the menu buttons, and it is becoming a problem if I'm on anything other than Gnome and I want to install an application that's only available through Gnome. Because as they illustrate down here, Ubuntu 2404 had to make this decision. There was no other scanner tool available, so they used the Gnome scanner tool, and you can see how out of place it looks when compared to every other application in Ubuntu, which looks like the one on the right. This has to do with how they are running their theming and a little bit about Adwaita, which is down at the lower part. But what Linux Mint has done is they've created these XApps. And the XApps are designed to be agnostic to your desktop environment, so you can run them anywhere and they look good on whatever desktop environment and theming set, and they integrate well. Now, what they have said is one of their mistakes is they have always had these and they've always been available for everybody, but most people assume they were part of Cinnamon or Linux Mint itself. And so what they're trying to do now is make XApps as an independent entity, pulling it out of Linux Mint, even though they're mostly designed to make sure that Linux Mint, Cinnamon specifically, has very well themed, very well working applications. What they said is that kind of prevented people from thinking that they were a separate thing. So if they had an XApp for the scan tools, Ubuntu could have used that instead of the Gnome scan tool and had Unity inside of their system. And so that's what Linux Mint is doing right now, is branching XApp off into a separate entity so that all of these XApps, which they designed to be operating system agnostic, or desktop agnostic, we should say, are now going to be a standalone thing. So you can use them anywhere, you can install them from anywhere, you can get them in the repository, and they should, in theory, respect whatever system theme on whatever desktop you're using. Except, I don't know, maybe Gnome, but whatever. So what they're doing is they're spinning this out. They're saying, yeah, our fault that we didn't reach out to groups like Ubuntu to say, hey, we have these options as well. Because even if you go in and look at different things, I think it was in Ubuntu Mate, I think they mentioned if you go and open up the calculator. Oh, it was, hold on, it was the calculator application. So Mate has the Mate Calc application, which does work everywhere. But if you open it up on Ubuntu, it says Mate Calculator. So if you know you're on XFCE, then you know you're not on Mate, and then you look in your software sources list, you say Mate Calculator, it might look good, but can we change the name a little bit? That's what they're attempting to do with XApps, because Gnome is becoming more aggressively independent to be Gnome itself, rather than respecting all of the other desktop environments. In other words, Gnome is kind of moving off this corner of the world saying, we don't want any part of the rest of you Linux community. Now, Linux Mint isn't making any snobbiness towards Gnome, and I'm just kind of jesting at it. I think Gnome is great for what it is and for the people that use it. It's not my personal cup of tea, but it does work very well within itself. It just doesn't like to play well, and if you have an application that doesn't necessarily respect it, well, that is in and of itself its thing. And so because of this, libadwaita is for Gnome only, and the more recent versions tend to break a lot of things. And so what they're concerned about is they're borrowing all the window architecture. There's losing menus. They might lose the navigation buttons. And so Linux Mint is concerned about this. And so for this is the Archive Manager, and this is Archive Manager for GNOME. File Roller 342 has always been labeled as for GNOME, but it integrated well with any GTK desktop, of which Cinnamon is. The File Roller 44, this is no longer the case. It looks like GNOME Scan in the previous screenshot. It's not made for Mate, Cinnamon, and XFCE, and it really shows. So by moving to GTK4/libadwaita, the app really became a GNOME app, an app which looks specifically designed for GNOME and for nothing else. So not wanting to change a lot going into the new version of Linux Mint, what they are opting to do is actually downgrade these applications to so these are the applications that they are downgrading for Mint 22. Font Viewer is removed. Hopefully we have a font viewer in there, because that, believe it or not, I'm a geek, I use that. Celluloid, GNOME Calculator, Simple Scan, Boabab, System Monitor, GNOME Calendar, and File Roller and Zenity. Those are all going to be downgraded to better respect the older decisions to allow you to better integration with the system. But what they said is all of those applications are nearly to be forked except for Zenity, which I've never heard of. And looking up Zenity, it really is something having to do with, GNOME integration stuff. So they said they're going to drop that altogether. So that way, let GNOME go and do its GNOME thing, which is perfectly fine and acceptable. But Linux Mint really wants to focus on creating these X apps which respond and are usable by all other operating systems, not just themselves. And so that's really what they're working towards. This is a little bit more explainer. Adwaita no longer works outside of GNOME. So the Adwaita theme will be removed from the list of available themes because here is in Ubuntu 24.04. So, of course, this is probably Ubuntu Cinnamon edition, since this is Cinnamon. And they're using the Adwaita theme, and what you're seeing is that some of these applications have dedicated icons and some of them don't. And that really is what their issue is, because, of course, GNOME is dropping some of the categories, streamlining things, not having as many applications. And so they're just saying it's not going to work. We don't want to have things that don't look unified throughout the system. So they're dropping it. And they said they're behind the curve because Solus already dropped them, or at least Bungie did. And so Bungie didn't wait for it to break and blacklisted Adwaita 2 years ago. Now they're doing it in Cinnamon. Mate and XFCE should probably do it, since it looks bad on any non-GNOME desktop. So that is there. All right. I'm sorry. This is a big update, guys. The next is Flatpak. Of course, we talked about in the weekly news roundup that Flatpak finalized its new site. They're doing a better job with the verified, albeit we did highlight a couple of small criticisms with the new platform. But what Linux Mint is going to do now is they're going to look at doing your verified applications a little bit differently. By default, verified applications are going to be turned, the non-verified applications are going to be turned off by default. Why? Because what he mentions here, and he does a great job explaining it, so I'll read what he says in his post. Linux Mint, it's safe to open the software manager, install Google Chrome. Is it? Yes, no. It depends, and it has nothing to do with how much you trust Linux Mint or Google. You need to trust Ryan Gonzalez. Because it isn't Mint or Google which updates the Flatpak for Chrome, it's Ryan. They say it happens. Ryan is a very nice developer. The problem isn't Ryan. The problem is that amongst 6 million people who've installed his Flatpak, very few people know who Ryan is. In FlatHub, a verified app is an app that is published by its original developer or a third party approved by the developer. Chrome is published by Ryan and is therefore unverified. So they say 42% of Flatpaks have been verified. The store is actively trying to verify apps, especially at the XZ story, and multiple times malware has been injected into the Snap store. So in Chrome, in the Linux Mint software store right now, this is all you see. There's no mention of Ryan, of verification, or anything else. They said they're going to be changing this in the next version of the software store. On the website, you see this unverified tag. And then, but even there, it says it is, you have to dig a little deeper to figure out who actually made it. So what they say down here is they're going to update the software manager to show unverified Flatpaks by default. to not show, unverified Flatpaks by default. So when you go into the software store right now and you look for Flatpaks, you will see everything. In the next version of the software store, unverified Flatpaks will not show up. You have to opt in to turn on the unverified Flatpaks. It should presumably be a simple button. When shown, unverified apps will have a score of 0. Score can help build user trust towards the application, but the issue here isn't the application. It is, in fact, the maintainers aren't the people they think they are. When shown, unverified apps will be clearly marked as unverified. So they do say that this goes against the convenience of Linux Mint and could hurt a little bit, but they think it's an important decision, and I agree with this, because what they say down here is in the XZ issue we've been, took over Firestorm a couple weeks ago, that developer would have actually been maintained. What worked and prevented that from becoming an issue in Linux is upstream developers. It takes the time for new code. This is a big criticism of all of these prepackaged systems, whether it's app images, snaps, or Flatpaks, is that the app is moving too quickly from the packager to the operating system with very few parts in between. The reason XZBug was discovered is because the process to get code into a Linux distribution can take a lot longer time. It goes up into some testing, it gets polled, it gets examined against the operating system itself. And during this time, a lot of very good, very intelligent programmers take this information and look at it, examine it, study the code, look for vulnerabilities, see any downstream impacts. And so it takes a period of time for that code to make its way into the operating system. Now, XZ would have been verified. And if they had released this as a Flatpak, it could have gotten its way actually into live production, because it goes straight from the maintainer, straight to your operating system with very few eyes in between. That is certainly a problem, and this is where the verified can help, but doesn't necessarily help, because it ultimately does depend, do you trust on those? And this is a downside of the Flatpaks, and why I prefer system applications before I prefer the Flatpak snaps or app images in general. So that is really what is up in the news. Absolutely amazing thoughts in here. So definitely go ahead and check this out. Again, this blog post will be linked down below. And with that, thank you guys for watching. If you've not already subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. Find us over on Matrix. You should be able to find us in that public directory now. Or if you can't find it there, tlm.li/matrix. That's going to land you on our main server room, and then you can choose which rooms you want to enter from there. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.